Hi everyone and welcome back to another video for Fantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis. In today's video we're just going to be looking at the next in the series of the weapon videos designed for new players to the game. And today we're going to be looking at the most recently released weapon, which is the Gunblade. So Gunblade is a weapon, it's classed as a ranged weapon, but it does have some very basic melee to it as well. But it is overall classed as a ranged weapon. And it's used by the Slayer class. So Slayer was the class that was most recently added to the game, and Gunblade is the only weapon that Slayer uses. So as a result of that, this video will be kind of an overview of the Slayer class in general, because Gunblade is the only weapon that it uses. So we're going to look at the weapon, the moveset for it. We're going to look into the Fortnite Arts. We're also going to look at the Slayer skill tree as well, just to see how that impacts how you use the weapon as well. So first thing I want to cover is, as I briefly mentioned, the Gunblade is treated as a ranged weapon. You can tell that by when you look at the weapon icons. And for anyone who doesn't know this, when you look at weapon icon, so if I load my storage, for example, all melee weapons, if you look next to the name of the weapon, there's a little icon that shows the weapon class. If that icon is orange, it means it's a melee weapon. You can see all these are melee weapons. All ranged weapons have a blue one. So you can see like assault rifles and launchers have a blue one. And all technique weapons, so weapons that forces and so on use, are yellow. So if you look at the Gunblades, you can see here they have a blue icon, which means they're a ranged weapon. So that means that when you're augmenting for Slayer, you want to be using augments that increase your range potency. Even though you might want to use it as a more melee focused weapon, it is treated as a ranged weapon overall. So the first thing I'll do is I'll cover the basic moveset of the Gunblade. So your standard attack with a Gunblade is just a very quick shot. It's not particularly long range. And it does reasonable damage, but it is quite short range, so you do need to be fairly close to the enemies to hit them with it. With that shot, you can also hold it for a short period of time and release it, which will do like a burst fire. You'll hear like a noise when it gets to that stage where you can release it. You can see it does like a quick burst fire instead. Alternatively, you can hold it for longer. The character will change pose into this pose, and then by releasing it then, you'll fire off a much more powerful charge shot. And that actually does really good damage. But you do need to hold the charge for quite a while. So, next thing to cover is the weapon action. So the weapon action is just a very basic slash. This can actually be used as a parry. So you can actually parry enemy attacks with this. But there is a little bit more to it as well. So you may notice that after an attack, my character glows briefly. Particularly after a charge went anywhere. So you can see she glows briefly there. If you're locked onto an enemy, it may be difficult to do it here because I might just kill them with a normal shot, but I might get the idea at least. So you can see that if you press the weapon action immediately after you do an attack and you're locked onto an enemy, you'll actually dash towards them. So I'll do it again. So that's just by pressing the weapon action after you've hit something with an attack, and you have to be locked onto the enemy to do it. Can't remember if you need a hard lock on or just have an enemy on target. We'll try that now, actually. Yes, I think you need to be hard locked on. I'll try that again. If I take the hard lock on off, I know you can do it with a soft lock on as well, but it's probably easier to do it with the hard lock on, just so you do actually dash towards that enemy. So that's a rough idea of the basic moveset for Slayer. As I say, you can also use this weapon action as just a basic parry as well. So if an attack's about to hit you, you can just do the weapon action to parry it. So that's the basic moveset. So the next thing to cover with Slayer is the Fortnite Arts. So Slayer at the moment has 4 different Fortnite Arts. You have Shifting Speaker, Flowing Sirius, Reaping Regulus, and Waving Regal. So Shifting Speaker is the first one. Now with Slayer, the way the Fortnite Arts work, it's quite similar to a few other classes. So the Fortnite Arts actually differ depending on whether you're moving when you input the Fortnite Art. So if you do Shifting Speaker from neutral, you do a very quick slash and a shot. You can actually hold this as well, and it will just continue. So that's the same as most Fortnite Arts in the game. You don't have to actually keep pressing the button, you can just hold the button if you want to keep doing the same Fortnite Art. If you input Shifting Speaker with a direction held, you'll actually dash towards an enemy and do a stab and a shot. And this actually has tracking as well. So I may be able to show you this. So if I jump up in the air and then do Shifting Speaker with the direction held, you can see I kind of dash down towards the enemy. See it again there. So if you're locked onto a target and you do Shifting Speaker with the direction input held in, you will actually dash towards wherever that target is. So it's actually really useful for example, bosses such as Diatil, which have a weak point really high up. So for example, the core that's on their back. If you double jump into the air and then do a Shifting Speaker with the core locked on, you'll actually dash up directly towards it, so it actually allows you to gain a bit of extra height. So there is actually a real good use for that Fortnite Art. It's mainly used, I would say it's mainly used as a gap closer. So the next one is Flowing Sirius. So Flowing Sirius, when you do it from standstill, it's just a few quick slashes. It's got quite a wide range on it, so you can hit quite a few different enemies with it. This actually does get more as well if you hold the Fortnite button. So just have to wait for my PP to restore a little bit. But yeah, with this Fortnite, if you hold the button down, you actually get a few more hits out of it. So again, you can see if I just press the button, you get those 3 hits. But if I hold the button down, you get a lot more. That's actually a really, really good Fortnite for doing damage to, particularly to bosses. So quite often you'll find that you'll rotate that Fortnite quite often against bosses with Slayer. So that's the Fortnite with no directional input. If you input a direction while you're doing it, you'll actually dash fairly far and do a flurry of slashes as you go, and that hits everything that's around you. So that is really, really good for dealing with large spawns of enemies. So for example, in PSE bursts, it's a really, really good way of just ripping through huge spawns of enemies. The damage isn't fantastic. It does a lot of small hits, but it's really, really good for just dealing with like smaller enemies that are in big spawns. It's also really good for building the gear gauge as well, which I'll cover in a moment. So again, that is that Fortnite. I should note as well that if you hold the button down with the direction held, it makes no difference. It's only for the stationary Fortnite that you get the extra hits. So the next Fortnite is Reaping Regulus. So with no directional input held, kind of hard to see, but you basically kick an explosive towards an enemy. So I'll find an enemy to target just so you can see how it works. This guy up here. So if I do it with no directional input, It is very short range if you have no input held. But you can see it kind of does a little explosion. That, in that state, if you don't press a directional input, I don't find it very useful at all. I really don't think it's worth using. If you hold a directional input with it, you actually kick it further. And it also seems to have a bigger explosion radius. It might just be me, but it seems like it has a bigger explosion radius. I don't know, maybe it's the same. But this, with no directional input held, is essentially point blank. You have to be right up in front of the enemy to do it. And to me, the damage just doesn't seem worth it. The directional input held one isn't too bad because you can actually kick in different directions. It's not bad for taking out enemies from a distance because it can actually fire further than your normal shooting range. So that is Reaping Regulus. So the other thing with that, with the neutral one, is when you press the button, you do actually, it's kind of hard to notice, but you do actually backdash. You also, again, it might be difficult to notice, but you also actually briefly put a shield up while you do it. That is probably the main benefit of that Fortnite, honestly. It does give you essentially like a parry state you can parry from. But overall, I don't tend to use it that much. And then finally, you have Waving Regal. So Waving Regal with no directional input held. It's kind of hard to see, but what you do essentially is you stab the Gunblade into the ground and it creates a shockwave around you. And anything that's in that area will take a hit. Actually really spammable. So it's good for taking out like spawns of enemies that are directly around you. So there is some use for it there. Damage isn't fantastic, but it is quite spammable. With the directional input held, it basically does a series of, it's completely different. It does a series of slashes that ascend into the air. That is, it's reasonably good damage. The problem is that against a lot of enemies, after using it once or twice, you'll probably be too high to actually hit them with it. So I would say it's better used against enemies that are very, very tall. So again, things like Dire-Tills. So what you might do is use Shifting Speaker with the direction held to lock onto the core and get up to it. And then you might use Waving Regal to actually do a bit more damage to it. And then maybe switch to Flowing Sirius once you're at the level with the car. So that's a rough breakdown of the Fortnite Arts for Slayer. So the next thing I want to cover is, so we'll cover the Fortnite Arts. So the next thing I want to cover is the gear gauge. So if you look at the bottom of the screen where my palette is, you can see here we've got the weapon palette here. And then just above it, there's a little icon of a Gunblade with a gauge next to it. And this is your gear gauge. It's actually 2 gauges. It might be quite hard to see on video though. So essentially, you've got this segment that's split into 5 here. That's the level of the gauge. And above it, there is, above the Gunblade, there is actually another gauge that goes across the top. So, again, this might be quite hard to see. But if you keep an eye on the gauge when I start attacking, so you can see that it builds up and then it starts to deplete. You can also see that the segmented gauge at the bottom is starting to build up slowly as well as I hit stuff. So that top gauge it's almost like a timer. So while that gauge is active, you'll keep your stocked gauge at the bottom, but when it expires, you'll lose that gauge. And basically what that gauge does is it increases your overall damage. So if I go to... Yeah, so if I go to the class skills... So Gunblade Focus is the skill we're talking about. So it is build up the focus gauge by hitting enemies, attack potency, and offensive PP recovery increase. Offensive PP recovery, if you don't know what that is the PP that you gain by hitting enemies with normal attacks. And PP consumption decreases in accordance with the gauge level. The focus gauge will reset to 0 after a certain amount of time passes without hitting an enemy. So It increases the rate that you get PP back from attacking, and decreases the amount of PP that you're using from Fortnite Arts, and increases your damage. And the buff that you get depends on the level of the gauge. So once you fill one of these 5 stocks at the bottom, you'll get a small increase, and for each level, you'll get a further increase. So in areas such as PSE bursts, you will find that you will fill this up to 5 quite fast, and that'll give you the biggest buff to your damage. Just be aware that if you don't attack an enemy for a while, this top gauge will deplete over time, and when that depletes, you will lose gauge. So that's roughly how the gear gauge works. So next thing we're going to cover is some of the Slayer skills. So we've already covered Gunblade Focus. So you can see, just to briefly cover this as well. So per level of the gauge, you get 1% potency increase per level, so up to 5%. You get 1% PP consumption reduction per level, so 5% reduction in PP cost. And you also get up to 10% offensive PP recovery increase per once you've got to level 5, so 2% per level. So the next skill is you've got Critical Up, which is really simple, it just increases the amount that you crit. So Slayer is quite heavily based around crits, so you want to be critting as much as you can with Slayer. Next one is Gallant Attack Critical Up. So Gallant Attack, what this does is it increases your critical hit rate when you're attacking a boss. So it's a straight up critical buff rate when you attack any boss enemy. Simple enough. Critical hit PP gain is there is a chance of recovering PP whenever you crit. So what you're doing with Slayer is you're increasing the chance of you getting a crit, and then every time you do crit, you'll recover PP. So it's not guaranteed. It looks like there's like a 70% chance at the level I've got it at. And you've got Short Range Hot Shot. That is, you get a damage buff, essentially, when you hit an enemy with a normal attack at close range. Which will be most of the time with Slayer, because Slayer, although it is a ranged weapon, it is a very short range weapon. It reminds me a little bit of Gunner with the twin machine guns, because they're quite short range as well. Then you've got Charged Blade. So pressing the weapon action at just the right time after a charged normal attack will unleash a thrust attack. So that's what I showed you before. So that is, you do a charged normal attack or a Fortnite Art. And that would normally do it. It's just because I'm not locked onto any enemies. But it's that dash forward that I showed you earlier. The next one is Gunblade Focus Overdrive. So this is an active skill that goes on your sub palette. What this does is when you activate it, you basically get a buff where your Gunblade gauge will just fill instantly. So what will happen is when you activate it, I might have it active now. No, it's not active at the moment, so I would need to like fight a lot of enemies to get it to activate. But basically what happens is when you activate it, it fills your Gunblade gauge, your focus gauge that I mentioned before. So it fills that up for up to 30 seconds. And then what happens basically is you will get rid of your focus gauge, and it will amplify the effects of Gunblade Focus. So it's kind of a strange skill the way it's worded. So what it basically does is you activate it when you've got a full gauge of gear. So you have to build your gear gauge up, your focus gauge up to maximum. When it's at maximum, you can activate this skill, Focus Overdrive. That will delete all of your gauge, but will give you the benefits of having a full gauge and amplify it further. So it's kind of an odd skill. It essentially gives you the maximum gear gauge effect, plus a bit extra stats. But it does get rid of your gauge to do that. So it's kind of strange the way it works. It's kind of awkward to explain. But essentially to activate it, you want to get your gauge to maximum first. Then you activate it. That will give you all the effects of the gauge that you had, plus a bit more. but will deplete your gauge. It works a little bit like some of the other skills in the game. Particularly, there's a skill that Braver has, which I think is it called Braver Combat or Katana Combat. It's a similar skill to that in that anytime during this Gunblade Focus Overdrive skill being active, you can actually press it again to deactivate it. And by deactivating it, it will hit all nearby enemies with a really powerful hit. So to show you this, I might have to go to a combat area. I'll tell you what, where's on the dailies for today? Because I might be able to do that. I think it's in Caveris, but I don't think there's anyone there at the minute. So what we'll do is we'll try and get a quick run in Resol Forest. And I'll show you that. And I want you to just watch the gear gauge. Watch the gear gauge, and you also want to be watching at the bottom of my sub palette. So, in particular, this icon here, this one second from the right, is the Gunblade Focus Overdrive. So keep an eye on this, because this will light up whenever I've got a full gauge. Let's try and get in a team just to make this a bit easier. So we've got a team at Vanford Laboratory, and we've got a PSE burst as well, which is actually ideal for this. So watch the gear gauge and also watch the Gunblade Overdrive icon at the bottom. That's strange, I got stuck on the wall there. So hopefully I can get there. It looks like the PSE is about to end, but we'll get a boss anywhere, so we'll also get that potency bonus that I mentioned on boss enemies. Alright, so we've got this guy here. So watch the gauges. So you can see the gauge is building up. So it's almost full. The gauge is full. Activate overdrive. Boss is dead, so you can see now the overdrive skill is active and my gauge is actually starting to glow. So that means that it's active now. So now if I just run to another squad of enemies, so I've got Gunblade Focus Overdrive active at the moment. We've actually got another boss here, which is ideal. So we're just about to run out. So if I target the boss now and activate overdrive again, it does that big huge AoE nuke, and that's how overdrive works. You see again, now we're back to having a normal overdrive gauge again. Yes, so that's roughly how it works anyway. But it's just a lot easier to show that in a combat zone where you can build the gauge up faster, because it does take quite a while to build. So that is your Gunblade Focus Overdrive. So next skill. As I said, normally these videos will just be a look at each weapon, but because Slayer only uses Gunblade, this is more just an overview of Slayer in general. So your next skill is Gunblade Focus Critical Up. This is just your critical hit rate increases according to your focus gauge. So the higher your focus gauge is, the higher your critical rate is. Simple enough. Gunblade Focus Gauge Amplifier. What this does is it amplifies the rate that your gauge builds up to the first level, is what I understand. So I think it gets you to like level 1 gauge faster. Then you've got Gunblade Focus Reset PP Gain. This is whenever your focus gauge resets, you'll recover some of your PP according to the focus gauge level you had. So if you have a maximum gauge level and then it expires, you'll get quite a lot of PP back. So you'll get 20% PP back at each level, basically. Well, sorry, 20% back once your gauge expires. Then we've got Slug Shot. So Slug Shot is pressing the normal attack button without inputting a direction right after performing a Fortnite Art will perform a short range shot. So you do a Fortnite Art and then a shot straight away. So that's the Slug Shot. So again, just do a Fortnite Art and then a normal attack straight after it without inputting a direction. There's just that really short range burst shot. It's nothing particularly special, that. Next one is Relentless Blade. So pressing the normal attack at just the right time while performing a Fortnite will allow you to perform an additional attack. Yeah, so basically you can get extra attacks out of certain Fortnites by pressing the button at the right time. Again, it's like simple enough, really. Next one is Gunblade Focus Overflow. So this is when the focus gauge is at maximum level, or while Gunblade Focus Overdrive is active, the Unleashed Rage gauge will charge up and its cooldown time will be reduced. So this is referring to another active skill that you have on your sub palette called Unleashed Rage. So what Unleashed Rage does is, as you attack with Fortnite, you'll build up a gauge for this skill, which if you look on my sub palette is this one here. So it is actually active at the minute. It works a little bit like the compound techniques that Force has. You know, the unified techniques. So you charge it up over time. Once you've got it, the charge will stay active until you use it, and then the cooldown will start. So for those two skills, they work in conjunction with each other. So obviously, Unleashed Rage is the actual skill itself. Gunblade Focus Overflow is it will charge the gauge for Unleashed Rage whenever your Gunblade Focus gauge is at max level. So it basically means that while you've got maximum Gunblade gauge, the gauge for Unleashed Rage will charge faster as well. So there is a lot of gauge management with Slayer. It sounds more complicated than it is. Once you actually learn how to use it, it's actually a lot simpler than it sounds. So what Unleashed Rage does is it basically does a very quick attack that does a decent amount of damage. So there is also skills that work with it as well. But Unleashed Rage, basically, all it does is it's basically a shot and then a couple of slashes. And you can see now it's on like a 20-second cooldown. So I can't use it again until that cooldown's expired. So once that expires, what you'll notice then is that it's just grayed out again. So now, again, it's hard to see, but above this icon, there is actually a little gauge above it. So now that the cooldown has expired, if I attack enemies, now this gauge above here will build up, and once that's filled up, this skill will be usable again. It actually does refresh really, really quickly, so it doesn't take long to use it at all. You'll probably be able to use it like every, I'd say every minute or so, if not sooner. So next up, we've got Blade Counter, which is when you successfully negate an attack using a weapon action. So I mentioned before that the weapon action is a parry. Using a normal attack or weapon action will unleash a counter. So it's not an automatic counter like some weapons have. So you will parry an attack with the weapon action. Then you need to follow up with an attack or another weapon action. And that will give you the actual counter. So it's a little bit more work than some classes for the parry, because you don't just get it automatically. Next up, we have Mobile Blade. So it's using a weapon action while inputting a direction will make you temporarily invincible and cause you to attack while moving. So that, it's really easy to show. It's just, you can see I kind of dash forward a bit when I use it. So while I'm doing this, I have temporary iframes. You can do it all different directions as well. And that's just by using the weapon action with the direction held. Whereas if you use it without, you just do the normal weapon action. For what it's worth, using this while you're moving does work the same, though. You can still parry with this. It's just that you do get the movement as well. So next one is Relentless Blade Reinforce. All this does, really, really simple. it just buffs the damage of your Relentless Blade, which is the extra attacks that you can get on some Fortnite Arts. Really simple. Then you've got Unleashed Rage After Effect. So this is, so it refers to Unleashed Rage, which is that one I just showed you a little while ago. So what After Effect does is, after you've used Unleashed Rage, it increases your critical hit rate for a certain amount of time. So it's at level 1, it's a 20-second buff, and it gives you a 5% increase in your crit rate. So you can see that Slayer is very heavily built around critical hits. Next up is Blade Counter Critical Up, which is when you do a Blade Counter, which again I've covered. So that is the parry. When you do a Blade Counter, it will increase the critical hit rate of that Blade Counter. You then also have Mobile Blade Counter, which is when you successfully dodge using Mobile Blade, using a normal attack or weapon action will unleash a counter. So the way it works, so using this without any direction held is like a normal parry that you can then use a weapon action or a normal attack to counter off. With the moving one, Mobile Blade, it works more like a dodge parry. So you basically dodge and then do an attack, or dodge and then do a weapon action, and that will give you your counter. So it works very, very similar, but it is actually based on a dodge rather than an actual parry. I suppose because when you do this, you have iframes, so you can't actually parry something if you've got iframes. So you just, it counts as dodging through the attack instead. So that is all the skills for Slayer. So you can see it's very, very heavily focused around critical hits. So you want to be using, for augments, really, you want to be looking at augments that increase your range potency. You also want to be using things that increase your critical hit rate, just so you can get that as high as possible. There is one exception I will want to cover briefly, which is with the most recent update, we got some weapons called the Verschmelz weapons, and their potential gives you 100% critical hit rate. That is, it's actually detrimental to use that on a Slayer. The reason for that is because obviously a lot of your skills for Slayer are based around increasing your critical hit rate. So by using a weapon that just gives you 100% crit rate, you're effectively negating a lot of your skills and making them pointless. So it's kind of better to go with, probably better to go with a weapon that increases your potency rather than your crit rate with Slayer, and then just build your critical rate up from your weapons. So last thing I'll cover just quickly is the Photon Blast for Slayer, since I've got it here. So again, it works kind of similar to the Gunblade Focus Overdrive. So it essentially just hits pretty much everything in the surrounding area. So it basically just hits a lot of enemies in the surrounding area. It tends to focus on one in particular, but then it can hit a couple of others as well. It's quite a good Photon Blast overall, but does take quite a while to do. So that's the Photon Blast. I think that more or less covers most of the things that Slayer can do. So it can be quite an intimidating class when you first look into it, just because it's obviously quite heavily based around critical hits. It's a lot of skills managing gauges and so on, so you're conscious that you have to look after your gauges and make sure that they're kept maintained. But honestly, once you play around with it, you find it is actually really easy to maintain those gauges, and it's a very, very simple class to use, honestly. Advantages is it has brilliant mobility. It's one of the fastest classes in the game, so you can run rings around some of the enemies. Very, very mobile. Damage is actually really nice as well. Because of all of your gauge management, you can, if you manage your gauges properly, you can maintain like good potency buffs quite often. The only real sort of drawback I would say of Slayer, well, there's two I can think of. So one of them is that it is a very short range class. Although it is treated as a range class, it is very short range. So you do always want to be quite close to the enemies. I would essentially treat it as if you're playing a melee class. I mean, a lot of the Fortnite Arts are melee, but they do range damage, but they hit a melee range. So I would treat it the same as like a melee class and just play it that way. Don't try and sort of keep away too much with Slayer, because you just don't really have the range for it. The downside of that is that the other problem with Slayer is it has very, very poor sort of defensive skills. So, in particular, its health is very, very low. I don't know if it's the lowest in the game, but it must be close to that. I mean, you can see at the moment I'm level 75. I've got reasonable augments. They're nothing amazing. I mean, this character can only just do Lucille. So if we look, I've got like the Ephetus and Eptize armors with the Claire armor. And I've got reasonable affixes. You know, Death Precision, Crocus Soul 4, Alt Secretor 4, Gegas Precision 4, Dreadkeeper 4, Deafness 4. So they're not bad affixes. They could be better. Ideally, you want to be using the affixes from Lucille. But you can see, even with affixes like that, I still only have 744 health, which is really, really poor. So you do find that Slayer is kind of a bit like a glass cannon. So you do need to be quite careful, and you probably want to be focusing a lot on using your mobile blade dodge counters and your weapon action parries, just to maintain your survivability. But overall, it's a really, really strong class. You know, the damage is really, really nice, and just the sheer mobility that you have over other classes is insane. You can just reposition at will almost. So I hope that's been relatively useful at least. Just as an overall breakdown of Slayer. As I've said before, these videos are kind of designed more for new players to New Genesis who might be just wanting to get into a class for the first time. I will do videos in the future that cover sort of good augments to look for and things like that, but these are mainly designed for people who are just getting into the game and just want a rough oversight of how the class works and what the skills do. So I hope that's been relatively useful. We will be going through all the other weapons in NGS over the next few weeks. Next one will probably be some kind of technique weapon, so probably either Wand or Talus. And we'll just alternate like that. So I hope that's been useful. Any questions at all, just leave them in the comments. You can also catch me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at section_Skyline. Any questions, just leave them on there. But for the meantime, hope it's been useful, and thanks for watching.